United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama Bin Ladin.
He was the Osama Bin Ladin of the Sinaloa Cartel. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration. That is what they called him, inside the cartel, on the streets of Culiacán, in the corridors of Mexican federal intelligence, and by the time you finish this documentary, you will understand exactly why. His name was Ren Velázquez Valenzuela. He went by El Sargento Phoenix, and in the long and brutal history of one of the most powerful criminal organizations on earth, he rose from nothing, a truck driver from Sinaloa, to become the second in command of Los Antrax, the most feared enforcement unit the cartel ever built. A man whose appearance was so striking, whose reputation for violence was so absolute, and whose loyalty to the organization was so complete that he became one of the most recognizable faces in the entire underworld. But I assure you, the real story lies in the details that most coverage conveniently skips over. Not just who he was, but how he got there. Not just how he died, but what was actually happening inside the cartel the night 70 Mexican soldiers surrounded the block where he was standing. The betrayals, the internal war, the one decision that may have put him in that exact spot at 4 a.m. with no way out. That is what this documentary is about. But before we get into the rise and fall of El Sargento Phoenix, you need to first understand the world he was born into. Not just the street level, but the full structural level. Because you cannot understand the man without understanding the machine that built him and the machine he served. Sinaloa is a Pacific coastal state in northwestern Mexico. For decades, it has been associated with two things that are almost inseparable in the public consciousness: agriculture and narcotics. The Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range cuts through the eastern part of the state, feeding into the region historically known as the Golden Triangle, a stretch of terrain spanning parts of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua that has been cultivating opium poppy and marijuana since at least the mid-20th century. Out of that landscape grew a culture, and out of that culture grew a criminal organization that would eventually become one of the most powerful drug trafficking enterprises in the history of the world. The Sinaloa Cartel, by the mid-2000s, had become exactly that. Under the leadership of Ismael Zambada Garca, known by his alias El Mayo, and Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known globally as El Chapo, the organization had extended its reach from the mountains of Sinaloa into distribution hubs across the United States, including Chicago, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Denver. The cartel had penetrated law enforcement institutions, cultivated political relationships, and established supply chains stretching from Colombian cocaine producers through Mexico and across the border in volumes that staggered investigators who spent their careers trying to dismantle it. El Mayo was, in many ways, the organizational mind behind the operation, where El Chapo was flamboyant and took the kinds of risks that eventually led to his arrest, extradition, and a life sentence in a federal penitentiary. El Mayo was methodical, quiet, and notoriously difficult to locate. He kept a tight inner circle, he moved constantly, and the security of his family was something he treated as a military-grade concern. That instinct, that the protection of the Zambada family required a specialized, disciplined, combat-capable force, is what eventually gave birth to Los Antrax. But here's where things get interesting, because the formation of Los Antrax was not just strategic planning. It was a direct response to a crisis that nearly tore the entire organization apart from the inside. January 21, 2008, Alfredo Beltran Leyva, known as El Mochomo, one of the most powerful figures in the broader Sinaloa Federation, was arrested by Mexican federal authorities. For years, the Beltran-Leyva brothers had operated as senior pillars of the alliance. They controlled transportation networks, enforced territorial boundaries across several key corridors, and were as embedded in the organization's power structure as anyone outside the Guzman and Zambada families. That arrest was catastrophic on its own, but what happened next made it a war. The Beltran-Leyva brothers became convinced that El Chapo had betrayed their brother to the government, that he had fed intelligence to federal authorities to eliminate a rival from the board. Whether that accusation was ever conclusively verified is a question the public record has never answered. What is documented is the consequence. The brothers severed ties with the Sinaloa Cartel and launched a war against their former allies. Within months, gunmen attributed to the Beltran-Leyvas killed Edgar Guzman Elpez, El Chapo's 22-year-old son, outside a shopping center in Culiacán. The war was now personal, and the body count would climb for years. For El Mayo Zambada, this fracturing created a specific and urgent problem. His family, his sons, who were themselves embedded in cartel operations, were now exposed to threat from a well-armed former partner who knew the organization's inner structure intimately. Something had to be built. And what he ordered, according to U.S. Treasury Department records and multiple investigative sources, was a new specialized unit named after the anthrax bacterium, chosen specifically for what anthrax represents, something invisible until it is already inside you, something that kills before you know you are infected. Los Antrax was born in 2008, and it was built for one purpose: to be the weapon El Mayo could point at anything that threatened what he had built. Now listen closely, because what comes next brings everything together. Because the man El Mayo's organization chose to help lead this unit, to be its chief of sicarios, the man responsible for training and commanding its killers, was not a cartel legacy. He was not a nephew of anyone powerful. He was a truck driver from Sinaloa named Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela, and the reason he got that job tells you everything about who he actually was. Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela had no family connections to the upper hierarchy of the Sinaloa Cartel. What he had was proximity. He was from Sinaloa. He knew the streets of Culiacán, and according to the publicly available record, he had been working as a truck driver before organized crime entered his life. Driving trucks in Sinaloa in the 2000s meant moving through a landscape thoroughly controlled by cartel logistics networks. The roads, the routes, the checkpoints, all of it operated under an ecosystem where the cartel's influence was ambient, constant, inescapable. For a young man with physical courage and limited options, the pull toward the organization was often less about ideology and more about economics, community, and the reality that the cartel represented the dominant power structure in the region for people in his position. He was reportedly contacted and recruited into Los Antrax in 2008, directly into its founding structure. The unit's hierarchy operated with deliberate precision. Members were assigned numerical code names. Jose Rodrigo Archiga Gamboa, El Chino Antrax, the unit's founder and commander, held the senior position. Zambada's nephew, Eliseo Imperial Castro, known as El Cheo Antrax, was the other principal figure in the command structure. Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela was assigned the codename L3 and designated chief of sicarios, the man responsible for training the unit's killers, coordinating armed operations, and making tactical decisions in the field during active confrontations. This is the thing most people miss when they talk about Los Antrax. It was not a gang of street gunmen who happened to work for the cartel. It was a paramilitary enforcement unit with a specific command structure, a specific mandate, and specific people it existed to protect. The unit was designed to provide armed security for El Mayo's sons, El Mayito Gordo, El Mayito Flaco, and El Vicentillo. These were the principals. Veltzquez himself was tasked with personally overseeing the security of all three of them at various points, which means he was directly embedded in the daily operations of El Mayo's family structure at the most sensitive level. But beyond personal security, the unit was also expected to function as a battlefield force, fighting rival cartels, eliminating internal threats, guarding drug shipments moving through Sinaloa's territory, and asserting dominance over Culiacan's criminal landscape with overwhelming and visible force. And almost immediately after Ren Veltzquez stepped into that role, his commitment to the organization was tested in a way that defined his entire reputation for the rest of his life. February 25, 2008, Veltzquez and El Chino Antrax were together in Culiacán when they encountered Mexican army soldiers. A firefight broke out. In the chaos of that confrontation, El Chino needed to get clear of the soldiers' position. What happened next? Now this was different. This was not the kind of loyalty you demand from someone. This was the kind of loyalty you either carry in your bones or you don't. Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela walked directly toward the federal soldiers with a grenade in each hand. He drew their attention. He held the line. He gave El Chino the seconds he needed to escape the scene. And then, once his commander was clear, Veltzquez surrendered himself. Why did he do it, you ask? Well, it all boils down to a simple calculation that runs beneath the surface of every cartel hierarchy. The man who proves he will sacrifice himself for the person above him becomes irreplaceable to that person. Loyalty at that level, putting your own body and your own freedom between your commander and capture, is the currency that buys everything inside an organization like this. It buys protection. It buys rank. It buys the kind of trust that cannot be manufactured or faked or negotiated. Ren Veltzquez spent that currency in one morning and earned a reputation that followed him for the rest of his career. He was sent to the Penal de Aguaruto, a prison in Culiacán, where he would serve the majority of a 6-year sentence. And here is where the story gets complicated in ways that the corridos never address. Because prison, for Ren Veltzquez, was not a break from organized crime. It was an extension of it. Intelligence sources alleged that while incarcerated, Veltzquez assumed a leadership role among the inmate population and reportedly controlled Module 5, the sector of the prison holding Sinaloa Cartel affiliated inmates facing organized crime and drug trafficking charges. To put that into context, this was not informal influence. This was a man allegedly running a sector of a Mexican prison as a sub-commander, while simultaneously serving a sentence for the very criminal activity that defined his role in the organization. The cartel's reach into the prison system was not a secret in Culiacán. It was understood by anyone with knowledge of how the institution operated. What was striking about Veltzquez was the extent to which he was documented doing it publicly. He had access to social media from behind bars and used it without apparent concern about the implications. Photographs he uploaded during his imprisonment showed him walking the prison yard surrounded by an entourage of inmates. In other images, he was smoking marijuana, playing with a pet raccoon, and receiving visits from cartel associates including Roque Landeros, Roque Antrax, another senior member of the unit. The images were not private. They circulated. They became part of the same public mythology that the narco-corridos were building simultaneously outside the walls. A man inside a federal prison, projecting the image of a man who was untouchable. He told prosecutors upon his arrest that he planned to reintegrate into society by working as a delivery driver for a local restaurant when he was released. What he actually did when he walked out of Aguaruto on August 22, 2014, was return directly to Los Antrax as its second-in-command. But before we get into what he did with that position, we need to talk about who he was visually, because the image is inseparable from the story, and the image is where that name comes from. Renveltzkas Valenzuela shaved his head completely. He grew a long, thick beard. He wore almost exclusively black tactical clothing. In photographs that circulated widely online, he projected the image of a man who wanted to look exactly like what he was: dangerous, disciplined, and deliberately intimidating. The look was not accidental. It was constructed and maintained. The nickname El Talib came first, earned by his physical presentation and the violent personality it reflected. Then El Gato Negro, the Black Cat. Then El Sargento Phoenix, attributed in part to time he had spent in Phoenix, Arizona, though the exact details of that connection are not extensively documented in public records. The Phoenix element also carried obvious symbolic weight, a figure who kept coming back, who survived, who returned from prison to reclaim his position and his rank. And then the name that defined how the world outside Culiacán understood him: the Osama Bin Ladin of the Sinaloa Cartel. To put that into context, this comparison was visual and cultural, not ideological. Renveltzkas held no extremist religious or political beliefs. He had no connection to international terrorism of any kind. The comparison was about the image he projected: the long beard, the shaved head, the black tactical clothing, the photographs showing him surrounded by armed men in the terrain of northwestern Mexico. It was a visual echo that anyone who had seen coverage of bin Laden would recognize immediately. And according to reporting from Infobay, Veltzquez was aware of the comparison and had expressed a form of identification with bin Laden's image, not politically, but as a symbol of a man who became globally recognizable as a force that larger powers could not easily find or destroy. Whether that framing was accurate or evolved in the retelling, what is clear is that the image he cultivated was real, deliberate, and effective at producing exactly the kind of fear and recognition he wanted. Now here's where it gets interesting in terms of how that image actually functioned. Because in the early 2010s, the intersection of organized crime and social media was producing something genuinely new in the landscape of Mexican narco-culture, and El Sargento Phoenix was one of its most visible examples. By 2010 and into the years that followed, several members of Los Antrax had developed significant online presences. Images of armored vehicles, high-caliber weapons, lavish gatherings, and territorial displays circulated across platforms that were not yet equipped to moderate content of that nature. Cartel figures who might historically have remained invisible were becoming recognizable to audiences far beyond their own territory. This served multiple functions simultaneously. It was intimidation directed at rivals. It was status projection within the organization. It was a form of cultural production that fed directly into the narco-corrido industry and generated new music, new songs, and new audiences for the mythology being built around these figures. Artists including Larry Hernandez, Enigma Norteo, Jorge Santa Cruz, Los Nuevos Rebeldes, Gerardo Ortiz, and Ariel Camacho all produced corridos that referenced El Sargento Phoenix by name, described his weapons, narrated his reputation, and framed his violence as a form of loyalty and professionalism that the genre celebrates. These were not abstract tributes to a lifestyle. They were specific, named, detailed accounts of a real person's criminal career broadcast to audiences across Mexico and the southwestern United States. But ironically, the more recognizable his image became, the more dangerous that recognition was to his operational security. Every photograph uploaded was a data point for intelligence services tracking him. Every corrido that named him, described his weapons, and confirmed his active role in the organization was a public document stating that El Sargento Phoenix was alive, active, and operating in Culiacán. Every platform appearance was a confirmation that he could be found. The very infrastructure that made him a legend was also, in a real and documentable sense, a map, and law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border were reading it carefully. The Sinaloa Cartel's war with the Beltran-Leyva organization was not fought in remote terrain. It was fought in the streets, neighborhoods, and public spaces of Culiacán itself, and Los Antrax was its primary instrument. The unit's operations during the late 2000s and into the 2010s included targeted killings, armed confrontations with rival gunmen, protection of drug shipments moving through Sinaloa's territory, and enforcement of the Sinaloa Cartel's dominance over Culiacán's criminal plaza. According to U.S. Treasury Department designations and multiple law enforcement assessments, Los Antrax was also in sustained conflict with Los Zetas, the ultra-violent enforcement group that had evolved from its origins as the Gulf Cartel's armed wing into an independent criminal organization with a national footprint and a military-style approach to violence. The Zetas had been built by former members of Mexico's elite special operations units and had introduced a level of tactical brutality into cartel warfare that reshaped the conflict across the entire country. For Los Antrax to hold its territory, it had to match that violence and exceed it. That was Ren Veltzquez's job. As chief of Sicarios, he oversaw the training of the unit's killers, coordinated its armed operations, and made the tactical decisions that determined how Los Antrax engaged its enemies in the field. His code name was L3, but functionally, he was the trigger. The man who held the operational machinery of the unit in his hands and made it move. Following the March 2009 arrest of Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Mayo's son, El Vicentillo, the Sinaloa Cartel instructed Veltzquez to establish a network of scouts across Culiacán municipality. This perimeter was designed to monitor law enforcement movements and report on any incursion by rival criminal groups. He was running a citywide intelligence operation from inside a prison cell. That tells you everything you need to know about how thoroughly the cartel had penetrated the prison system and about how trusted Veltzquez had become in the hierarchy. If you take the time and do your homework, you can find out that the human cost of Los Antrax's operations across Sinaloa during this period was staggering. In May 2011, the Mexican army engaged 3 members of Los Antrax in a neighborhood in southern Culiacán, killing all 3 and liberating kidnapping victims from a safe house in the area, including a woman, a man whose toes and ears had been mutilated, and a 5-year-old girl. Post-mortem examinations indicated the 3 gunmen had been beaten and tortured before death, a finding that contradicted the official account of a firefight and was documented by human rights investigators covering the conflict. In November 2011, gunmen opened fire during an indoor soccer game in Culiacán and killed Francisco Arce Rubio, Pancho Arce, one of Los Antrax's senior founding members. A single weekend following that killing saw at least 20 homicides across the state tied to the ongoing conflict. Bodies were found hung from bridges in Guamchil. Bullet-riddled corpses appeared throughout the state. An entire city, over 900,000 people at the time, developed informal systems for reading which neighborhoods were safe and which were not on any given day. Mexican federal forces had been escalating their operations in Sinaloa since President Felipe Calderon's military offensive against organized crime launched in 2006. By 2009 and into the early 2010s, tens of thousands of troops were deployed across the country in a strategy designed to dismantle cartel infrastructure through direct military engagement. The approach produced significant captures and confirmed eliminations among cartel leadership. It also produced significant controversy, with human rights organizations documenting widespread allegations of torture, extrajudicial killings, and civilian casualties that official accounts consistently failed to acknowledge. For a figure like El Sargento Phoenix, operating in that environment meant calculating exposure at every moment. The threat was not only from the Beltran Leyvas and the Zetas, it was from an increasingly aggressive military and federal intelligence apparatus that was specifically targeting Los Antrax as a high-value dismantlement priority. And beyond all of that, it was from something potentially more dangerous than any external enemy. The internal fractures that were beginning to develop within the Sinaloa Cartel itself. When El Chino Antrax was arrested by Dutch police at Amsterdam Airport Schiphol on December 30, 2013, picked up at the airport after reportedly traveling to the Netherlands for New Year's celebrations, Los Antrax lost its most visible commander. He was extradited to the United States in 2014. The arrest reshuffled everything, and that reshuffling set the stage directly for the return of Ren Velzquez. He was released from Aguaruto on August 22, 2014, having served the majority of his sentence. When he walked out, he returned directly to Los Antrax as its acknowledged second-in-command, with El Chino gone, other senior figures dead or arrested, and the unit needing someone with his reputation and his operational experience to hold it together. But did any of the pressure ease when he returned? Well, no. If anything, it compounded. By 2015 and into 2016, the Sinaloa Cartel was navigating one of the most turbulent periods in its history. El Chapo had escaped from the maximum security Altiplano prison in July 2015 through a tunnel dug directly into his cell. An embarrassment for the Mexican government that made international headlines and confirmed to anyone watching that the cartel's resources and reach were essentially unlimited. Then, on January 8, 2016, he was recaptured in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, following an intelligence operation that tracked him through his own communications. His extradition to the United States followed in January 2017. That recapture changed the internal balance of the Sinaloa Cartel in ways that reverberated through every faction. With El Chapo in federal custody and facing trial, the question of who controlled what became more acute and more dangerous. The factions aligned with El Mayo and those aligned with El Chapo's sons, Los Chapitos, began to diverge in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Lines of loyalty that had always existed as subtext became active fault lines, and the intelligence community, the Mexican military, and sources close to the organization all began registering the same signal. Los Antrax, as a unit primarily aligned with the Zambada family, was operating inside a cartel that was quietly at war with itself. At 4 a.m. on October 30, 2016, a convoy of approximately 70 Mexican Army soldiers in at least 15 vehicles was moving through the streets of Culiacán in response to reports of armed men in an outlying area called San Alona. As the convoy moved, soldiers overheard gunfire near the 9th Military Zone. They rerouted. They moved toward the sound. And when they arrived at the Las Quintas neighborhood on Miguel Hidalgo Street at the intersection with Esteban Flores and Alejandro Quijano, they found something they may not have been entirely expecting to find. Several senior members of Los Antrax were at a gathering inside a home. It was the early morning hours of a Sunday. When the cartel members became aware of the soldiers' presence, the gathering became a confrontation immediately. Some members attempted to flee in their vehicles. Others tried to escape across rooftops and through the yards of neighboring properties. A red Toyota moved along Miguel Hidalgo, with its occupants firing on soldiers as it went. The firefight lasted 30 minutes. 2 tankettes arrived as reinforcements. When it was over, 3 men were dead, 3 were injured, and 3 more had been detained. The Army seized 5 assault rifles, 1 fragmentation grenade, and 10 vehicles, at least one of which was armored. Shell casings from AK-47s and other assault rifles were scattered across the scene. The purger seized the home where the gathering had taken place. Ren Velázquez Valenzuela was identified almost immediately. His shaved head and long beard made him recognizable. He was found inside one of the vehicles, dead from gunshot wounds. His colleague, known as El Cali, described as another key figure within Los Antrax, was also confirmed dead. The PGR identified Velázquez as El Sargento Phoenix, second in command of Los Antrax and acting head of the unit's assassination operations. The Army deployed 50 troops to the public hospital in Culiacán, where the injured survivors had been taken, establishing a security cordon to prevent any rescue attempt by the organization. But here's the part that might actually interest you, because the official account of that night describes a military patrol that encountered a cartel gathering through a chain of rerouted responses to unrelated gunfire. The anonymous reporting that came out of Culiacán in the days that followed told a different story. You see, sources who spoke to multiple outlets claimed the Army knew exactly where Velázquez was that night. They had received a tip, a specific tip, from inside the organization itself, and the name that circulated in those reports as the person who allegedly provided that tip was Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, El Chapito, the son of El Chapo Guzman. The backstory runs through El Chino Antrax. At least 2 years before that October morning, El Chino and Ivan Archivaldo had reportedly had a serious falling out at a bar in Sinaloa. The nature of that dispute was never officially documented, but the tension between Los Chapitos and the Zambada-aligned leadership of Los Trax was entirely consistent with the broader fracturing happening inside the cartel following El Chapo's recapture in January 2016. If Los Chapitos were moving to consolidate control over Culiacán and assert their own dominance, eliminating the leadership of the unit most loyal to El Mayo was not just useful, it was strategically logical, and it would not leave fingerprints. Here's something no one actually talks about. Ren Velázquez was reportedly not at the Las Quintas gathering when the confrontation began. He was in a different neighborhood, Guadalupe, and radio communications pointed to the possibility that members of Los Antrax called him to the scene to bring reinforcements after the soldiers had already arrived. One theory that circulated among sources in Culiacán was that Velázquez and his men engaged the army that night to cover the escape of El Mayito Flaco, Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, one of El Mayo's sons, from the soldiers. If accurate, that would mean the last act of El Sargento Phoenix's life was the same as the first defining act of his career in 2008, moving toward federal forces to buy time for the people he served. The first time, he walked out with grenades in his hands and surrendered. The second time, he did not walk out. None of these accounts have been officially confirmed. No arrests or charges related to an alleged betrayal have materialized in the public record. What is documented is that the Army had actionable intelligence that night, that it led directly to a confrontation with senior leadership of Los Antrax, and that 3 of those leaders died in that confrontation. On November 1, 2016, authorities released his body to his family. A wake was held at a home in El Salado, a rural community within Culiacán municipality. The coffin was white. It cost 35,000 pesos and was covered in flowers from his wife, his daughters, and a friend identified in press coverage as El Changuito. Narco-corridos played. He was buried in the Panteón de El Salado. His mausoleum was decorated with statues of demons, portraits of fallen associates, a virgin surrounded by skulls, and bottles of tequila. The only question left to answer is what actually happened to Los Antrax after he was gone, and whether anything the unit built survived him. The losses had been compounding for years before October 2016. Redel Castro, El Pocho Antrax, killed in a shootout with the Beltran-Leyva cartel in Tubutama, Sonora, in June 2010. 3 members killed by the Army in May 2011 under circumstances that post-mortem evidence contradicted in the official account. Francisco Arce Rubio assassinated at that soccer game in November 2011. Roque Antrax dead in February 2012. El Chino Antrax arrested in December 2013, extradited to the United States, released to house arrest in 2020, and then murdered in Culiacán on May 15, 2020, alongside his sister and brother-in-law, less than 3 months after walking free, an event that itself confirmed the cartel's internal war had not ended just because El Sargento Phoenix was dead. The unit that had once functioned as the most feared enforcement arm of the Sinaloa Cartel's Zambada faction had lost its founding members one by one to arrest, betrayal, and death. By the mid-2010s, what remained of Los Antrax had essentially folded into other Sinaloa-aligned structures operating in the Culiacán area. Reporting from sources within the city suggested surviving members merged with a group known as the Quimales. The Los Antrax name, the structure, the brand, the hierarchy of numerical code names, effectively dissolved as a functioning command. El Chapo's extradition in January 2017 removed the cartel's most globally recognized figure from the board entirely. His trial in the Eastern District of New York from 2018 to 2019 produced a historic volume of testimony from cooperating witnesses, including Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Vicentillo, the very man Los Antrax had been built to protect, that laid the organization's structure bare in federal court in ways no law enforcement action had previously accomplished. The rising power of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel presented a challenge to Sinaloa's national dominance that the Beltran-Leyva conflict never replicated. The Sing expanded aggressively, engaged the military directly, and moved into territory Sinaloa had previously held without serious competition. By July 2024, El Mayo Zambada himself, the man whose family Los Antrax had been constructed to protect, whose sons Velzquez had spent his career guarding, was in American federal custody, reportedly lured onto a plane in Mexico and flown directly to the United States in a move that triggered a wave of unprecedented violence across Sinaloa. The organization Ren Velzquez Valenzuela had served with his freedom and his life was a fundamentally different entity than the one that had recruited a truck driver from Sinaloa in 2008. Other organizations are watching and have tried to study how the Sinaloa Cartel maintained control for as long as it did. But even if they wanted to replicate what El Mayo built, they are not likely to succeed, because the conditions that enabled that level of dominance were specific to Sinaloa's geography, its political history, its deeply embedded community networks, and the decades of loyalty that figures like Ren Velzquez gave to it. You cannot export that loyalty. You cannot manufacture it. And as Los Antrax demonstrated, you cannot even sustain it once the leadership starts feeding its own people to the government to settle internal scores. There is a broader pattern at work in stories like this one. And it matters, because it shapes how we understand what these figures actually represent versus what the culture built around them says they represent. The mythologization of cartel figures through narco-corridos, social media, and online video has created a genre of celebrity that runs parallel to the documented historical record but never honestly intersects with it. The songs produced about El Sargento Phoenix described a man of almost superhuman violence and unshakable loyalty. The photographs showed a figure who inhabited a world of total power, surrounded by weapons, by followers, by the aesthetic symbols of cartel authority projected across platforms to audiences who had no way to verify what they were seeing against reality. The narco-corrido does not capture the arrest. It does not capture the 6 years in a prison module in Culiacán. It does not capture the possibility, never officially confirmed but widely reported, that he drove toward a military confrontation in the early hours of that Sunday morning, because someone inside his own organization had already told the army where to find him. The corrido captures the myth. The history captures the reality the myth was built to replace. When we look at these figures accurately, without the corrido playing in the background, without the online photographs framing the image, we see something more complex and more honest. Men who operated inside a structure of extraordinary violence, who sometimes rose to significant positions within that structure, and who almost without exception ended their careers in prison, in exile, or dead. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is the structural logic of the institution itself. The cartel uses loyalty as a resource, and resources get spent. Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela's life, examined in full, represents something specific about what the Sinaloa Cartel's enforcement apparatus actually cost, not just to those it targeted, but to the people who served it. He was not born into the organization. He came to it as a young man from a working-class background, in a state where the cartel was the dominant economic and social power for people in his position. The path he took led to a role that required him to perform violence, absorb violence, train others in violence, and eventually die by it. The same loyalty that defined his reputation inside the organization, the willingness to walk toward federal soldiers with grenades in each hand, was the quality that made him useful to the people above him, because it made him a resource they could spend. And resources get spent. His story is inseparable from the stories of the thousands of people across Culiacán, across Sinaloa, across the communities that had no part in the conflict and no way to avoid its consequences. The families who lived near safe houses used by Antrax. The people at that indoor soccer game in November 2011 when Francisco Arce Rubio was assassinated. The 5-year-old girl found in that safe house in May 2011 where 3 members of Antrax died. The residents of Las Quintas who were woken at 4 in the morning by 30 minutes of sustained gunfire on their residential street. The thousands of people across the state who spent years learning to read their own city like a war zone because of what units like Antrax made of it. The myth says he was a legend. The record says he was the commander of a hit squad in a narco war that devastated a Mexican state for over a decade. Those two things are not the same. It is important to hold both of them clearly and to understand what separates them. His coffin was white. His daughters left flowers. Narco-corridos played, and in the months and years that followed, the organization he died defending was already becoming something else. Fractured, diminished, pressed from every direction by the forces that had been building for years before that Sunday morning in Las Quintas. In the end, El Sargento Phoenix did not rise from the ashes. He was buried in El Salado, in a mausoleum decorated with the imagery of a world that had consumed him. That name spoke to an image. The story behind the image speaks to something the corridos never address, that in the world of the Sinaloa Cartel, even the most recognizable face is eventually just another name on the list of the dead. That is the story of Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela. El Talib. El Gato Negro. El Sargento Phoenix. The Osama Bin Ladin of the Sinaloa Cartel. A man whose image outlived him, and whose end came exactly the way it always does for men who climb that high inside that world, in the dark, before sunrise, with soldiers closing in from every direction and absolutely no way out. Ren Veltzquez Valenzuela is gone, but the cartel that shaped him the internal war that ultimately consumed him, and the question of what that absolute loyalty was ever actually worth to the men who received it, none of that story is finished being written. And if history is any guide, the next chapter is going to look a whole lot like the last one.